The wire arrived in Jefferson City on a Thursday in March of 1883, and by the following Monday, the Harlan Crossing Town Council in Wyoming Territory had their answer. They had asked for a schoolteacher. They had specified in the advertisement circulated through the Missouri State Teachers Association that the position required someone of steady temperament, willing to work under the direction of the council, prepared for conditions that would be, in the wording of Council Chairman Orville Peck, somewhat frontier in character. They had not specified a man because they had assumed one. They had assumed specifically a young man fresh from a normal school, without strong opinions about curriculum, grateful for a wage, and unlikely to cause the kind of trouble that came from knowing too much about what a school was supposed to be. The wire that came back gave them the name Nettie Crane. 27 years old, 3 years of teaching experience in Columbia, and before that a year of normal school in St. Louis. References enclosed by post, available to depart within the fortnight. Orville Peck read the wire twice. He passed it to the man sitting to his left, who passed it to the man on his left, and by the time it completed the circuit of the table, the 5 members of the Harlan Crossing School Committee had all arrived at the same private conclusion: that the name, Nettie Crane, was female, that the temperament of a woman from Missouri who could arrange her own departure within the fortnight was probably not the steady and directionless variety they had advertised for, and that the schoolhouse, which was still 6 weeks from finished, was going to be a problem. It was that last detail that brought Russell Jordan into it. Russell was 34 years old that spring, foreman of the Briggs-Patterson Ranch on the eastern edge of the valley, a man who had come to Wyoming Territory from Colorado 9 years earlier, with very little to recommend him except a reliable back and the sense to keep quiet when he did not know something. He had the ranch running the way Walt Briggs wanted it run. He kept the fences tight. He hired men who could read weather. He did not drink past Tuesday. These were the things Harlan Crossing knew about Russell, and for the most part they were enough. What Harlan Crossing did not know, and what Russell had taken considerable care to keep private, was that he could not read well. He could cipher numbers, slowly and with effort. He could pick out the shapes of a few dozen words if the printing was large enough, and the light was good. Letters written to him he handed to Walt with some invented excuse about his eyesight. Forms requiring a signature he signed without reading, trusting that the other party was honest, or at least not dishonest, in a way that would cost him immediately. It was a gap he had lived around for 9 years without anyone's help, and he intended to go on living around it. When Orville Peck came to see him in late March, Russell was mending a section of corral fence near the barn. Orville sat his horse rather than dismounting, which was how Orville delivered requests he expected to be declined. He said the council had a woman schoolteacher coming from Missouri and no place to put her until the schoolhouse was done, and that he was asking Russell to house her at the ranch. He said the ranch was the closest decent property to the building site. He said it would only be 6 weeks or thereabouts. He said the council would cover the cost of her room and board at the same rate the hotel in Sheridan charged. Russell looked at the fence post he was bracing. He said he would think on it. Orville said thinking on it would be fine, so long as thinking took no more than 2 days, because the woman had already confirmed her departure. What Orville did not say, and what Russell understood without being told, was that every other property owner in Harlan Crossing had already been asked and had already declined. Russell said yes before Orville made it back to the main road. The train from Sheridan arrived on the 14th of April, which was a Saturday. Russell drove the buckboard the 11 miles to the depot himself, arriving a quarter hour early and spending that time standing beside the wheel with his hat in his hands, watching the platform. He had formed certain expectations. He was not the kind of man who would have stated them aloud, but they existed. a woman of schoolteacher bearing, careful and contained, dressed for propriety rather than weather, carrying a single bag and prepared to be grateful. Nettie Crane stepped off the train carrying 2 bags herself and a wooden crate on a shoulder strap. The crate held books. He could see the spines shifting against the slats when she set it down to survey the platform. She was shorter than he had imagined, with brown hair pinned under a gray hat, and she did not look around the depot with the expression of someone grateful for what she found. She looked around it with the expression of someone calculating what would need to change. She spotted him by the buckboard and walked over without hesitating. "You'd be the rancher," she said. "Foreman," he said. "Russell Jordan. The ranch is Walt Briggs's." She considered this like a correction worth noting. "Nettie Crane," she said. She handed him the heavier bag without asking whether he minded. "How far?" 11 miles, he said. "Road's tolerable until the last 2. "That's a qualified answer," she said, and picked up the crate herself. He drove. She asked questions about the valley, about the number of families settled nearby, about whether the schoolhouse would have a stove. He answered in the short, declarative way that served him in most situations, and she received each answer as data rather than conversation, which he did not mind. By the time they reached the point where the road became less than tolerable, she had established that there were 14 children of school age in the immediate valley, that the schoolhouse stove had been ordered but not yet arrived, and that the nearest doctor was 31 miles east, in a town that was itself not reliably accessible in bad weather. "And the children," she said, "are all 14 enrolled?" He said he believed 12 had been registered with the council. She was quiet for a moment. The buckboard dropped into a rut and climbed out of it. "Which 2 were not registered?" she asked. He told her about Thomas Runningwater's son, a boy called Eli, whose father ran a small mixed herd on the valley's south end and who was Shoshone, and about the Garza girl whose family had come up from New Mexico and whose father spoke limited English. He told her this in the same flat way he told her everything, and he watched the side of her face while he did it. What crossed that face was not surprise. It was a particular kind of recognition, as if she had been waiting for the specific nature of the obstacle and was now satisfied to know its shape. 12 enrolled and 2 left out, she said, and the council thinks I'll accept that. "Council thinks you'll accept most of what they put in front of you," Russell said. He had not intended to say it. It came out flat enough that it could have been a simple statement of fact, which he supposed it was. Nettie Crane turned and looked at him directly for the first time since they had left the depot. He kept his eyes on the road. "Do you?" she said. "Doesn't matter what I think," he said. "You're the teacher." She turned back to the road. "Yes," she said, "I am." The room she was given was the one off the back of the ranch house that had been storage since Russell had been there. He had cleared it 2 days prior and moved in a cot, a washstand, and the only lamp he could spare from the main room, without darkening it entirely. He had cut a week's worth of wood for the small stove in the corner, more than was likely needed in April, and stacked it beside the door. He had not expected her to notice the wood. She noticed it immediately and thanked him for it with the same direct economy she used for everything else, which was somehow both less and more than a longer expression of gratitude would have been. She settled within a day. Her books came out of the crate and arranged themselves on the windowsill in some order Russell could not read, but that was clearly not random. She rose before he did most mornings and had already started the kitchen stove by the time he came through. He ate more predictably than he had in years, which he attributed to having another person in the house who regarded irregular meals as inefficiency. Walt Briggs came by the first Wednesday to look in on the situation, which was his phrase for it. Walt was 51, wide through the shoulders, with a face that had been shaped by 30 years of Wyoming weather into something like a bluff overlooking a river. He had a dry, patient wit that he deployed sparingly and a way of assessing a room that missed very little. He shook Nettie's hand in the kitchen doorway, accepted a cup of coffee, and said to Russell afterward when they were out at the barn, checking on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg, that the council was going to have its hands full. Russell said he had arrived at the same conclusion. Walt said it without any particular distress, which was how Walt said most things. Classes started the first week of May, held in the unfinished schoolhouse at a row of temporary benches the fathers had built from scrap lumber. 14 children came on the first day, not 12. 14. Eli Running Water sat in the second row with his slate and a short pencil his father had sharpened to a careful point. The Garza girl, whose name was Maria, sat at the end of the first row with her hands folded and her eyes watchful. Nettie taught that first morning as if neither of their presences was anything other than ordinary, which in her estimation it was, and which in the estimation of the fathers who had gathered in a loose group near the door was nothing short of a provocation. Orville Peck was among them. He waited until the noon recess to make his position known. He said that the arrangement agreed upon by the council was for 12 students, that the 2 additional children had not been approved for enrollment, and that he expected Miss Crane to respect the terms of her position. Nettie was eating her noon meal on the steps. She finished chewing before she responded. She said she had reviewed the Territorial Education Statute, which provided for the schooling of all children resident in the district regardless of origin, and that the council's enrollment decision was inconsistent with the statute. Orville said the council's arrangement was the relevant authority in Harlan Crossing. Nettie said she understood his position. She said she would continue to teach all 14 children until the Territorial Superintendent's office instructed her otherwise in writing, and that she would be writing to that office the following Monday to clarify the matter. She took another bite of her meal. Orville looked at the door of the schoolhouse, then at the children moving around the yard, then at Nettie Crane. He said something under his breath that might have been a comment on the nature of Missouri women and their opinions of their own authority. Then he rode back toward town. He did not write to the Territorial Superintendent. Russell suspected this was because Orville knew, as most men in the valley knew, that the territorial government was not in the habit of siding with local councils over qualified teachers, particularly in the spring of 1883, when the legislature had just come through a session debating school funding and had opinions about the matter. Russell had not been at the schoolhouse that noon. He heard about it from Walt, who had been. She didn't raise her voice, Walt said that evening. They were on Russell's porch, the last light going low over the valley to the west. Didn't lean forward, didn't put down her fork, just told him how it was. Russell said nothing. He had been thinking about it most of the afternoon. "You worried?" Walt asked. "About what?" "About whether it sticks." Russell thought about the 14 children on the benches and Nettie Crane's expression when she had said the word 14 like it was the only defensible number. "No," he said. Walt nodded. He finished his coffee. "Didn't think so," he said. By June, the fathers had largely stopped appearing at the door during school hours. The enrollment question had reached a low, cold equilibrium, with Orville Peck making occasional remarks at the feed store about the proper scope of a teacher's authority, and Nettie continuing to teach 14 children 5 days a week without remarking on his remarks. Eli Running Water had proved to be a quick learner with particular facility for sums, which pleased Nettie visibly, and which she noted aloud to his father when Thomas Running Water came to collect him one Friday afternoon, plainly enough that 2 other fathers standing nearby had to hear it. At the ranch, the arrangement had settled into its own quiet rhythm. Nettie wrote letters on Sunday evenings, a steady correspondence with the territorial office and with colleagues in Missouri. And with what appeared to be a sizable network of acquaintance, she maintained with the regularity of someone for whom connection was a form of infrastructure. Russell worked his days and came in for supper. They ate. Sometimes she read at the table after the dishes were cleared, and he sat across from her working through the week's tallies for the ranch accounts, which he could manage well enough in numbers even where he could not manage them in words. It was the accounts that gave it away. She had not pried. She had noticed, the way she noticed things, which was without announcing that she had noticed. One evening in late June, she had been writing at one end of the table and he had been working at the other, and she had glanced across and seen the ledger open at a supply invoice, and seen, he suspected, the way his finger was moving along the line of printed text, tracing it slowly without turning the page. She had said nothing that night. But the following evening she set a primer on the table beside the ledger. Not a child's primer, she said, but one used in adult continuation classes in Columbia. She said she kept it for students who had come to school late in life, and that she found it useful. He looked at the primer. He looked at her. She had already returned to her own writing. He opened it. That was the arrangement they never discussed and both held to. She did not treat it as remediation, and he did not treat it as charity. On evenings, when the work permitted, he read from the primer and she corrected him without comment, in the same tone she used to correct Maria Garza's arithmetic, which was to say without any suggestion that the error was surprising or the learner inadequate. He learned the way a man learns a thing he should have learned earlier, doggedly and without showing what it cost him. By August, he was reading supply invoices without his finger on the line. By September, he had worked through the primer twice and started on a volume of natural history she pulled from the windowsill and set in front of him one evening without explanation. He did not tell Walt about the lessons. Walt, he suspected, already knew because Walt knew most things that happened within the orbit of people he cared about, and chose which of them to acknowledge accordingly. He never mentioned it. This was the nature of Walt's loyalty, which was active and largely wordless. Orville Peck brought his youngest daughter, Clara, to school in May, and she was still there in September, which said something about what Clara Peck was getting from the schoolhouse that she was not getting anywhere else. She was 9 years old, watchful in the way of children who have learned that adults are unreliable narrators of their own behavior, and she had attached herself to Nettie with the intensity of someone who has been looking for a specific thing for a long time and is not willing to let it go now that she has found it. Clara asked Nettie once in September why she had come all the way from Missouri to teach in Wyoming. Nettie said she had come because there were children here who needed to learn, and because Missouri had enough teachers already. Clara thought about this. She said, "My father says you came because nobody in Missouri wanted you." There was a pause in the schoolroom. Several children looked up from their slates. Nettie said, "Your father is entitled to his opinion, Clara. Copy the sentence on the board, please." Clara copied the sentence, but she had watched Nettie's face when the words landed, and what she saw there was not hurt and not anger, but a kind of settled patience, as if this particular variety of small cruelty was familiar enough to be managed without incident. After school, she told Russell about it. She was in the habit of stopping at the ranch on her way home because it was on the road, and because Russell had got into the habit of having a piece of cornbread available at that hour for reasons he declined to examine. He listened to her account of the exchange. He said, "And what did you think of what your father said?" Clara considered. "I think he's wrong," she said. "She teaches better than anyone who doesn't want to be somewhere." Russell said that seemed right to him. It was October when the weather turned serious. The first cold rain came through on a Tuesday night, hard and lateral, the kind of rain that arrived in the territory not as a transition but as an argument. By Wednesday morning it had dropped 15 degrees, and the road was 3 inches of mud over frozen ground. Nettie rode back from school on Wednesday evening in it. The distance wasn't long, only 1.5 miles from the schoolhouse to the road that led to the ranch, but the rain had been driving all day, and she had stayed late to check on Maria, whose older brother had not come to collect her and who had waited at the schoolhouse until the boy finally appeared at 4 in the afternoon. By the time Nettie reached the ranch road, it was past 5, and the temperature had dropped again, and she was wet through in a way that the coat she had brought from Missouri was not designed for. She made supper. She did not say she was cold. She went to her room early. By Thursday morning, she had a fever that Russell could see from the doorway when he looked in. The high color, the shallow breathing, the stillness of a body that is conserving everything it has for the work of staying warm. He sent word to the schoolhouse with one of the hands, then went back to her room and put more wood in the stove. She said she would be fine by afternoon. He said he did not doubt it and went to make broth. What Nettie did not know, and what Russell had not yet told her, was that he had learned enough from the natural history volume to look up the section on fever in the medical almanac Walt kept at his place, which Walt had ridden over to lend him that same morning, arriving before 8 in the company of his ranch cook's broth in a covered pot and an armload of dry wood he said he had extra of. Walt stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still dripping and looked at Russell's face and said, "How bad?" Russell said he did not know yet. Oh, he said he thought 2 days, maybe 3. Walt said he would come back tomorrow. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of what was going to happen, rather than an offer that required acceptance. It was 3 days. The fever climbed on Thursday night and held through Friday, and Russell slept in the chair by her door those 2 nights with the medical almanac open across his knee. He read the relevant pages slowly, running his finger down the lines without embarrassment now, looking for the markers that distinguished a fever breaking from a fever worsening. He changed the cloth on her forehead when it went warm. He got broth into her twice a day, by the method of simply putting it in front of her and waiting. He did not talk much because she was too tired to carry conversation, and he was not a man who filled silence with noise. And the room was quiet except for the stove and the wind, and on Friday morning, the sound of Walt's horse on the yard road coming back as promised. On Friday afternoon, her breathing changed. He had been reading in the chair, the almanac, and then, when he had read the relevant section twice more, the natural history volume, and he heard the difference before he looked up. Slower, deeper. The fever was dropping. She slept through Friday night without the restlessness that had marked the 2 nights before. Russell slept in the chair again, because there was no point in going to his own room now. Saturday morning she woke up and asked for water and then asked how long she had been in bed. He said 3 days. She was quiet with that. Then she said, "The children." He told her Walt had ridden to the schoolhouse Thursday morning and found a neighbor woman to sit with the class Thursday and Friday, and that he had sent word to Thomas Runningwater, whose boy Eli had apparently taken it upon himself to lead the younger children through the morning arithmetic, both days in Nettie's absence, which had impressed the neighbor woman considerably. Nettie turned her head on the pillow and looked at the ceiling. "Eli Runningwater," she said with a particular satisfaction. 11 years old, Russell said. Ran the arithmetic lesson both mornings. Of course he did, she said. There was a long, comfortable quiet after that. The stove was warm. The window showed a pale November sky with no more rain in it, the worst of the weather having run itself out over the 3 days of the fever. He was still in the chair. She was still in the bed. The natural history volume was closed on his knee. She said, "You've been reading?" He said he had. She said, "The almanac?" He said the almanac and the natural history book both. She looked at him then, not quickly, not with the directness she used when she was calibrating a situation, but with something quieter. "Good," she said. And then, after a pause, "You read it well enough to know what to do." He said that seemed to be the case. She said she was glad of it. The best things, in Russell Jordan's experience, arrived without announcing themselves as what they were. She was up and moving carefully by Sunday. Walt came again Sunday afternoon, stayed for supper, and said less than usual, which meant he was attending to the temperature of the room rather than its conversation. He left before dark, and on the road home he decided, without fanfare, that things at the Briggs-Patterson Ranch were going to be different by spring, and that this was not his business to manage, and not a thing that required his opinion. He was right on the first count, and right on the second. It was 3 weeks after the fever, on a cold morning in late November, with the first real snow of the season moving down from the north, that Russell came into the kitchen while Nettie was writing her Sunday letters and stood at the window for a moment looking at the snow. He said, "I'd like you to stay." He didn't say anything else. He kept his eyes on the window. Nettie set down her pen. She was quiet long enough that the kitchen felt smaller than it was, all the space between the stove and the window, and the table full of something neither of them was naming. She said, "In what capacity?" He turned from the window. He said, "Whatever you're willing." Another pause. Outside, the snow moved sideways across the yard. Not hard yet, but decided. She said, "I'll stay." That was all. What followed was not a rushed transformation, but a simple continuation of the life they had already built without having a name for it. She kept teaching. He kept the ranch running. In December, she wrote to Missouri to finalize certain practical matters, and received in return a letter whose contents she did not share, and did not need to, the relevant business being hers, and the outcome of it being that she stayed. A circuit preacher came through Harlan Crossing on the second Friday of February, a lean and weathered man named Brother Hollis, who made the Valley Circuit twice yearly, and who asked no unnecessary questions about arrangements already arrived at. The wedding was in the ranch kitchen on a Saturday morning, with Walt Briggs standing at the table, and 6 of the school children crowded in the doorway because Clara Peck had told them it was happening, and nobody had thought to tell her to keep it to herself. Clara stood in the front of the doorway with her arms crossed, and her expression suggesting she had organized the entire event, which, in a practical sense, she had. Brother Hollis said the necessary words. Nettie and Russell each said yes at the appropriate moment, neither of them inclined toward elaboration. Walt shook Russell's hand with some force, and then shook Nettie's hand with the same force, which she accepted as the compliment it was. Someone had brought a dried apple cake, and it was eaten. Orville Peck heard about the wedding from his daughter on Saturday afternoon and made no immediate comment. He was not a man who revised himself quickly or visibly, but Clara was watching him with the patience of someone who has decided to wait. And what she observed over the following months was a slow, grudging recalibration that never involved an apology and never needed one. By the following spring, he was sending Clara to school without comment and stopping at the ranch road occasionally when he was passing to ask Russell about the condition of the East Valley fence line, which had been a matter of mutual concern since the previous autumn. He never said he had been wrong. The fact that he kept coming back said it for him. The school ran through the winter of 1883 and through the spring of 1884 and beyond, outlasting the doubts that had been placed against it like stakes in bad soil. The territorial superintendent's office wrote twice that first year. The first time in response to Nettie's inquiry, and the second time in response to a report she submitted about the valley's enrollment figures, which were the highest of any rural district in the county. The letters were addressed to Miss N. Crane, and then, after the wedding, to Mrs. N. Jordan, and the office seemed not to find either of these facts particularly remarkable, which was the appropriate response. Eli Runningwater finished the school at Harlan Crossing and went on to the county school in Sheridan, and from there, years later, to a teaching certification of his own, which is a different story but belongs to this one at its edges. Maria Garza's family stayed in the valley, and her younger brothers all came through the school in their turn. And Clara Peck grew up. She was 13 when Nettie first suggested, quietly and without pressure, that she had a gift for explanation and might consider what she would do with it. She was 17 when she sat for a teaching examination in Sheridan and passed with the highest marks in the county that year. She was 19 when she stood in front of her first class in a schoolhouse 2 valleys east of Harlan Crossing and arranged 14 children on their benches and began. She came back to Harlan Crossing every fall for as long as Nettie was teaching, and she sat in the back of the classroom sometimes and watched and said nothing. And Nettie ignored her presence with the courtesy due to a professional who already knew what she was looking at. Russell learned to read well. This is worth stating plainly, because it was not a small thing dressed as a small thing. By the winter of 1884, he was reading the ranch accounts himself and corresponding directly with the feed suppliers in Sheridan. By 1887, he had read through most of the books on the windowsill and had opinions about some of them, which he expressed sparingly and with the same declarative economy he used for everything else, and which Nettie received with a straight face that nevertheless showed, in certain light, something that was not quite a smile, but was first cousin to one. He never forgot the 3 nights in the chair by her door, and she never forgot that the chair had been there. Neither of them ever mentioned it after the fever. It did not require mentioning. It was part of the structure of the thing they had built, load-bearing and therefore unnecessary to point at. Walt Briggs remained what he had always been, which was the kind of friend who arrives before you ask and leaves before you need to thank him. He was at the ranch for roundup in spring and branding in summer and for the occasional Sunday supper throughout the year, and he and Russell and Nettie sat at the kitchen table in the manner of people who do not need to perform ease, because they have it honestly. He was still coming to supper in the winter of 1907, older and slower but fundamentally unchanged, and he was still there when Nettie finally retired from the classroom in 1924, 41 years after she had stepped off the train at the Harlan Crossing Depot, with 2 bags and a crate of books and an expression that said she was calculating what would need to change. 41 years of children in the valley. 41 years of slates chalked and corrected, of primers worn to soft covers, of parents who had doubted her and then sent their second and third children through the same door. 41 years of Russell coming to the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons when the weather was bad enough to make the walk inadvisable, pulling the buckboard up to the door without announcing himself, waiting. He died in the spring of 1929, in his 80th year, in the ranch house he had lived in for 46 years. Nettie died the following winter at 73 in the same house. They are buried together on the hillside above the valley east-facing, in ground that looks out over the ranch and the old schoolhouse site, and the long, slow roll of the valley toward the mountains. Clara Peck, who was 65 by then and had been teaching for 46 years herself, spoke at the service. She said, standing on the hillside in the cold November air, with a small group of valley people around her, and the wind coming down from the north, that the school had not really been for the children. Someone asked her what she meant. She said the school had been for all of them, the children and the fathers and the men who had needed to be wrong before they could be right about anything. She said she had understood that at 9 years old and had never had reason to change her mind. She folded her hands. She looked at the marker for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back down the hill, and the valley held its quiet, and the November light lay even and pale over the whole of it. Some things teach the whole room, whether the room knows it or not. If you have ever known someone who changed a place just by refusing to be smaller than it deserved, leave a word for them below. And if you want another story from this valley and the hard, unhurried lives that made it, it is waiting for you.